Remember when the start of World War II was triggered by Hitler's invasion of Polish territory, which prompted war declarations from both France and Great Britain? Well, the South China Sea, which has a total area of about 3,500,000 square kilometers, is a marginal sea of the Western Pacific Ocean that could set off a great war if China refuses to relax on their journey. Now look at this map. Here is the South China Sea, a portion of the Pacific Ocean that spans over 3.5 million square kilometers from Singapore to the Strait of Taiwan. Clockwise from north, this sea is surrounded by 7 states, including the People's Republic of China, Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, and Vietnam. Although there are a number of significant sea lines of communication, SLOC, that provide access to the South China Sea, including the Sunda Strait and the Lombok Strait, the Strait of Malacca is without a doubt the most commonly traveled. Just after 7 oceans, it is the largest body of water in the world with an area of 1.351 million square miles. Owing to its great importance, this sea could cause a big problem because China is not only breaking international laws and agreements, but it's also breaking into other countries' territories without their consent. Is China truly carrying out its strategy to attack 5 nations at once? If so, why? What could be the outcome of China's actions? Well, the South China Sea issue has commanded a lot of media attention during the last decade, once underwater reefs have been changed into sandy islands with airfields, roads, buildings, and missile system bases as China constructs islands in the South China Sea. The South China Sea has become one of the most disputed waterways in the world in less than 2 years as a result of China's conversion of 7 reefs into 7 military sites. One of the reasons US Army analysts believe that the South China Sea islands have the greatest potential to trigger World War III is that the CCP is resistant to accepting and keeping away from the borders of other nations. For you to fully understand what exactly is going on here, I'm going to break this video into 3 different segments. I'll explain why the South China Sea is so important to the world, why China is willing to start World War III in order to gain control of these marine areas, and why the United States needs to take action. The South China Sea isn't the only sea in the world, so why in heaven's name does everyone keep talking about it? Before I tell you why China is willing to engage in so many conflicts with other nations over the South China Sea, I'm first going to discuss what makes the South China Sea and the surrounding region so crucial to China and the entire world. This small sea in the Pacific Ocean, the South China Sea, is bordered by South China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Whether or not the region's fish stocks are quickly declining, it's expected to contain at least 28 billion barrels of oil, 266 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and 1/3 of the world's marine biodiversity. As a result, this region is significant for the ecosystem. And in addition to all these reasons, the South China Sea is also a major commerce route. As of 2019, $3.37 trillion worth of global trade travel through this region each year. The Strait of Malacca and the South China Sea serve as the main routes to and from ports in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Since China's economy and industries are significantly dependent on oil imports, China buys around 50% of its oil from the Middle East, and that oil travels across the South China Sea. Without a doubt, China is the world's manufacturing hub, and the sale of those made items to other countries is what drives the country's economic growth. The South China Sea is a major route for China's exports to the rest of the globe. From all indications, you can see that China places a lot of importance on the South China Sea. But does that imply that China owns it? Well, you'll find the answer to that question as you watch this video. Economically, there is a wide variety of marine life in the South China Sea. The enormous discharge of nutrient-rich water from the land and the upwellings of water in some parts of the ocean both contribute to this abundance. Yet, the heavily populated Southeast Asian region primarily obtains its animal protein from the sea, which is widely fished. The numerous species of tuna, mackerel, croaker, anchovy, shrimp, and shellfish are the most prevalent, and residents consume almost the entire catch, whether it's fresh or preserved. Additionally, substantial oil and gas reserves have been found beneath the South China Sea's surface. North of Borneo, east of the Malay Peninsula, and northwest of Palawan are the primary regions for hydrocarbon production. Furthermore, some of the busiest shipping routes on Earth pass through the South China Sea. The South China Sea and the Strait of Malacca serve as the primary passageways to and from ports on the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Typically, food and manufactured products travel south and oil and minerals move north. There are several poorly sounded regions in the middle South China Sea, and these locations are noted on nautical charts as dangerous ground. International territorial conflicts, particularly those involving the Spratly Islands, which are shared by Malaysia, Brunei, the Philippines, and Vietnam, and to some extent by China and Taiwan, have more recently led to their categorization of being dangerous because the islands are located in an oil-rich zone. But why is everyone faulting China? Well, as it is with a typical family setting, when there's a dispute over a piece of land or property, probably after the demise of the father, the parties involved, the children, would come into agreement and possibly enact laws that would prohibit an individual from going beyond his boundaries or acting against their agreement. In the same way, China and some other countries went into agreement several years ago to allow for peaceful coexistence. According to the law of the sea that was signed in a UN convention in 1982, each country's sovereign territorial waters extend to a maximum of 12 nautical miles, which calculates to about 22 kilometers beyond its coast, while foreign vessels are granted the right of innocent passage through the zone beyond its territorial waters, and every coastal country may establish an exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, extending 200 nautical miles, which is about 370 kilometers from shore. Within the EEZ, the coastal state has the right to exploit and regulate fisheries, construct artificial islands and installations, and use the zone for other economic purposes. Since this law was made, every country recognizes the law, including China, and this is actually how every country has claimed their part of the South China Sea, 200 nautical miles from their coast. However, it seems that China is no longer willing to obey this law. There are some overlaps in Vietnamese, Malaysian, Brunei, and Filipino claims, but no one is talking much about that because all of these countries are united together against China's claim. You see, when it comes to this part of the sea, China doesn't want to follow the law of the sea anymore, and in fact, China wants to follow the made-up 9-dash line to exert its claim. This 9-dash line covers almost 90% of the South China Sea, and the CCP claims that it's all part of China now. Well, in my opinion, claiming at least 90% of the South China Sea is more like claiming the entire sea for oneself, and that's exactly what China is doing. You may be wondering what is the reason behind this 9-dash line, since there are no laws or really anything that mentions it. Well, according to the CCP's reasoning, they believe that a Chinese explorer discovered the South China Sea, so therefore the sea belongs to China. This really is the reasoning the CCP has used to claim pretty much the whole South China Sea, and it has led to some very confrontational situations with other countries. Some parties involved in the dispute renamed the region with their jurisdiction in September 2012 in order to formally proclaim their claim. Similarly, in 2017, Indonesia renamed the northern regions of its exclusive national jurisdiction in the South China Sea as the North Natuna Sea, while the Filipino president signed an executive order requiring all government entities to refer to the areas of the South China Sea within the Philippines as West Philippine Sea. But while all of this was going on, the CCP began to construct its own military-grade islands in the South China Sea in an effort to assert its sovereignty. They had an airport, a few military troops, and a missile defense system in place. Because these islands were close to their boundary with the Philippines, China was sued by the Philippines in a UN court. Then, in 2016, The Hague ruled in favor of the Philippines, which claimed that China had in fact infringed on their territory. However, one could tell that this ruling didn't go down well with China since the CCP chose to ignore it and has not put it into effect. Even worse, the CCP released a declaration that aircraft passing through it would require Chinese approval, designating the airspace above the disputed land as a defensive air identification zone. Although they assert that this move will only be used for defense, it has further soured relations between these two nations. Furthermore, something else raised tensions between the surrounding countries, and that is the Spratly Islands. The Spratly Islands are a group of islands located in the middle of the South China Sea that all the nations are vying to control. The fundamental justification for this is that by establishing a claim to the islands, you can expand your EEZ and take control of a larger portion of the South China Sea. The Spratly Islands were, however, declared to be a ROC in a 2016 ruling, meaning that they do not extend any country's exclusive economic zone. This actually killed some of the island's significance and reduced tensions between the nations seeking to control the islands. However, it does not mean that the conflict has subsided, because China has been using a tactic known as the cabbage strategy, or the salami slicing strategy, to cut off supplies to foreign islands. To do this, China would surround an island or territory under foreign rule with its ships and destroyers to prevent competitor countries from entering, and afterward attempt to ultimately claim the islands and its territories for itself. Now, it goes without saying that the United States has many allies in this battle, and if war were to break out, they are known to have the most powerful navy in the world. But the US Navy is not after waging war against other nations. One crucial role played by the US Navy is preserving maritime stability so that global trade can continue uninterrupted. The US Navy has boosted its presence in the South China Sea as a result of China's hostile behavior to maintain stability. Due to Beijing's claims in the South China Sea, particularly to two historical rights along the so-called Nine-Dash Line, the United States' long-standing commitment to freedom of the seas is imperiled. This dedication supports security and prosperity, ensures equitable access to resources, reduces naval tensions, and stabilizes global trade. Now let's take a look at the accusations against China. Western authorities believe that China is making remarkable developments on many uninhabited land features in the South China Sea as part of its ongoing efforts to solidify its claims to disputed territory in an extremely important economical and commercial location to the world. China has militarized and developed ports, runways, and other facilities on disputed reefs, islands, and land formations in the region in that it has long been controlled. The authorities displayed pictures of what they claimed to be the first recorded cases of a country doing so on territory that it does not already possess. Although it's still too early to tell whether or not China would try to militarize them, they caution that the most recent development activity in Beijing signals an intention to advance a new status quo. According to the officials who requested anonymity to discuss sensitive intelligence, 4 uninhabited features in the Spratly Islands have seen building activity over the past 10 years by fishing fleets acting as de facto maritime militias controlled by Beijing. According to them, several sandbars and other structures in the area have grown more than 10 times in size recently. Images of Eldad Reef in the northern Spratlys reveal massive holes, debris heaps, and excavator tracks at a location that was previously only partially exposed at high tide. According to the officials who claim that new land formations have emerged above water over the past year. The Philippine military was believed to have taken a snapshot of the reef in 2014 that showed what officials claimed was a Chinese marine vessel unloading an amphibious hydraulic excavator used during land reclamation efforts. They said that the Panata Island in the Philippines at Lankiam Cay, where a feature had been strengthened with a new surrounding wall over the course of just a few months last year, had also experienced similar actions. Additional pictures demonstrated physical alterations at Whitsun Reef and Sandy Cave, where things that were once underwater are now permanently above the high tide level. When asked to address the allegations, China's foreign ministry in Beijing responded that the relevant report is completely made up. However, the Philippine Foreign Ministry said in a statement following the publication of the report that any reclamation activities by China on unoccupied features would be in violation of agreements Beijing and Southeast Asian countries have on how to behave in disputed waters, as well as a 2016 ruling by an international tribunal that said China's claims were without legal foundation. Based on a 1947 map with ambiguous lines that have since come to be known as the Nine-Dash Line, China claims to hold ownership of about 90% of the South China Sea. It has asserted in the past that it has the sovereign right to construct on its own land. As Beijing increased its investments in naval and coast guard ships to enforce its claims, tension between Beijing and the other South China Sea claimants, including the Philippines, Taiwan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Brunei, have been building up for years. The formerly small and uninhabited Spratly Islands have gained geopolitical significance due to their proximity to one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world and potential military use, particularly if tensions over Taiwan lead to a regional conflict. Several countries in the region have increased defense spending and started reclamation projects as a result of China's moves. While Vietnam increased dredging and landfill operations at many Spratly outposts, the Philippines voiced its displeasure about Chinese ships crowding two reefs close to Reed Bank, a contentious region where the two countries have talked about collaborating on an oil and gas exploration plan. Around 175 nautical miles, 324 kilometers to the west of the country in Whitsun Reef, the Philippines similarly gathered ships last year after over 200 Chinese militia ships were detected engaging in a similar swarming tactic. Even before the recent uptick in hostilities, Beijing and Southeast Asian countries signed a non-binding statement of conduct in 2002 that urged the parties to avoid inhabiting the now unoccupied reefs, islands, shoals, cays, and other structures. While states continue to concentrate their efforts on battling COVID-19 and recovering from the aftermath, security threats to the current international system still persist. The Maritime Traffic Safety Law (MTSL) of China went into effect on September 1st and mandates that all foreign vessels entering Chinese territorial waters must inform maritime authorities, possess the necessary permits, and submit to Chinese command and control. This follows the approval in February of a new law in China allowing the China Coast Guard (CCG) to use force against foreign vessels violating Chinese sovereignty. However, both rules have significant effects on the global order, and they also violate the requirement of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, which gives states the right of innocent passage without the need for prior consent from the government of the coastal state. China seems to undermine the UN laws as they pass laws before that violate international law and infringes upon the sovereignty of other nations. For around 3 decades, China has been progressively expanding its jurisdiction at the disputed waters. Other nations were troubled by the 1992 law on the territorial sea and contiguous zone, particularly those whose interests were jeopardized by China's Article 6, which read that foreign military ships shall obtain permission from the government of the People's Republic of China to enter the territorial sea of the People's Republic of China. The UNCLOS regulations on setting the benchmarks from which the territorial sea and other marine zones are measured were also broken by this law. China used the straight baseline technique, establishing baselines between a number of islands located far from its shore. China expanded its resulting territorial sea and exclusive economic zone (EEZ) by setting baselines that were far beyond what was permitted by UNCLOS and violating other countries' rights to exploit those waters as permitted by international law. Beyond what is permitted by international law, Chinese internal legislation offers it the chance to use coercive measures in order to further its territorial objectives at the expense of the territory and sovereignty of neighboring states. In particular, Article 12 of the Coast Guard Law of February gives the CCG the authority to defend Chinese maritime interests, artificial islands, and infrastructure and construction in waters that China claims as its own. In accordance with Article 20 of the same law, the CCG is also authorized to destroy foreign-built structures, floating objects, and islands under its control. By establishing the categories of foreign vessels that must report their information when navigating and berthing in pilotage zones, the MTSL also gives China the authority to further regulate activities in its waters. Since the pilotage zones in the MTSL are unclear, this has caused concern among competing claimants in the South China Sea. While the majority of the South China Sea is claimed by China, the MTSL allows Beijing to establish pilotage zones in contested areas and even inside the EEZs of other claimants. One element of China's three warfares policy is the establishment of proactive legal positions to protect national interests without engaging in physical conflict. In 2003, this policy was formally incorporated into China's game plan with specified long-term goals. The MTSL and Coast Guard law go beyond simple transgressions of international law. Instead, they support China's claims by deploying their own legal system. The inherent ambiguity gives China plenty of leeway to interpret the laws as necessary. Additionally, it is unclear in the new maritime law how strictly, broadly, or even if the new legislation will be applied, and if it will, over what geographical area. When it's stated that applicable laws, regulations, rules, and provisions will be applied to deal with vessels failing to report to the Chinese Maritime Administration, a notice for foreign ships regarding the new maritime law released on September 1st was also ambiguous. Any state is capable of upholding and violating international law simultaneously. China aspires to be an order maker in addition to being a permanent member of the UN Security Council, so whatever it does matters. China aims to change the established order in the region, and it is working hard to reshape maritime norms and laws by enacting domestic legislation. One could argue that the new Coast Guard law poses an immediate threat to other nations that are embroiled in conflicts with China in the East and South China Seas. The idea that China seeks to create a legal foundation to support physical confrontation on the high seas is greatly strengthened by the fact that it is now imposing an altered maritime law that places additional limitations and rules on foreign ships. China can readily enforce its domestic law in the places it governs thanks to its expanding economic and military might, regardless of whether those areas are actually under its legal control. China has upgraded its naval fleets and masked militia ships into behemoths to outclass neighboring warships and law enforcement agencies, with its military spending expected to hit $252 billion high in 2020. In this situation, it does not appear to be particularly difficult for Beijing to require ships from smaller countries to abide by the legislation. Now let us examine China's cunning attack strategy. China began carrying out its five-nation strike strategy in 2014 when it began constructing military islands right here in the South China Sea, inside other nations' borders. In the event of a war, these fictitious isles have ports, air bases, and anti-aircraft weaponry that are already prepared. China has created 7 of these islands within the borders of other nations without their consent in the past 2 years, and it's evident that they're ready for attack if need be. I'll be giving you a detailed explanation as to why many think that these islands in the South China Sea have the greatest potential to ignite World War III. Straight to the point, it all started with the CCP and its refusal to respect other nations' borders. More so, with China's defense systems in place and ready to strike, it's obvious that China is prepared to wage war on the surrounding nations and anyone that would interfere. What guarantees do we have that China will abide by other rules if it can flout international law and claim land at the same time? What guarantees do we have that other nations won't follow China's lead? Because of the CCP's actions in the South China Sea, US-China tensions are also increasing. Despite the fact that under COVID there was more peace, China's actions are once again escalating in the South China Sea, and this time Beijing is breaking its own pledges and going back on its own words. In order to facilitate the settlement of conflicts, China, Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei, Taiwan, and the Philippines reached an agreement in 2011 on a series of preliminary rules for implementing the South China Sea Declaration of Conduct. In keeping up with the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, China and the ASEAN nations intensively advanced the talks on the Code of Conduct, or COC, in the South China Sea, with the expectation that the COC will be finished by 2021. As you can see, the schedule for resolution hasn't really worked out, but the COC has contributed to some degree to keep the South China Sea peaceful. No nation is permitted to construct on uninhabited reefs, which is a key stipulation in the COC. Yet, recent sources suggest that China's chosen to discontinue adhering to the COC. Building and construction has been done at 4 uninhabited features by fishing fleets that operate as de facto acts as maritime militias under the supervision of Beijing's government. According to a source, Eldad Reef in the northern Spratlys has seen the emergence of new land formations above water over the past year, and images from the site show enormous craters, debris heaps, and wrecks made by excavators. Activity at a location that was previously just partially exposed during high tide could mean a variety of things about the CCP's future plans, and none of those possibilities are favorable to world peace.